Welcome to an uplifting dialogue, stories about how the arts powerfully transform life with Susan Brender. This is V for Vitality.
This show has been made possible by the support of Plantronics, an endpoint company celebrating 50 years of innovation. I'm Susan Brender, and this is V for Vitality. Almost all of us have heard the names Isadora Duncan or Martha Graham, but how many of us have heard the name Pearl Primus? Peggy and Murray Schwartz, friends and colleagues of Primus, have written a biography, The Dance Claim Me, to tell the full story of Primus, who single-handedly lifted African dance to the American stage. I want to welcome Murray Schwartz and Peggy Schwartz to our show. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Murray Schwartz. Murray Schwartz has taught Shakespeare, psychoanalysis, and Holocaust history for over 40 years at several prestigious universities around the country. Currently, he's at Emerson College in Boston. Peggy Schwartz has had a career as a dance educator, also spanning more than 40 years, and she is currently at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Together, this team have taken the great, complicated life and legacy of Pearl Primus and have given us a way to learn and breathe and feel Pearl's life journey. Okay, welcome to Peggy and Murray Schwartz. Hello.
Hello, glad to be here.
Thank you for that introduction.
So, Murray, tell us, why Pearl?
Well, the answer has to do with a long and deep relationship that she had with our family, and that is connected with both our professional lives, because in 1980, we first came in contact with her because she applied for a position at the State University of New York in Buffalo. Of course, Peggy knew her history and knew that she was part of dance history, but I didn't. And because Peggy let me know who we were dealing with, this relationship began, and it's continued until the present.
So, well, it sounds like you knew Pearl. However, the reality for you was that she was in the dance world and she was an icon. For you, why was it important to write about her?
Well, I think Peggy should tell you about that.
Yes.
Well, initially, the research began without a concept of where I was headed with this study. It began as an act of mourning. She died in 1995. I assembled a little bit of grant money and was able to do some professional interviews with Joe Nash, the late Joe Nash, a dance historian, Donald Washington, who was with the Ailey Company, and several others. As I continued then and I became more involved with seeking out people that she had known and who had known her well from across her many different worlds, people whose names she had told, whose lives she had told me about in the context of her life, I began to realize that I was gathering materials that were not available anywhere else, and I needed to consider whether this was going in the direction of a documentary film, of a biography, of essays of what, and finally, without too much hesitation, realized that the direction that I wanted to pursue was writing a biography.
And writing of a biography, and especially using the expression that you do in your book, which is that she stunned audiences. She was a pioneer in dance, education, anthropology, African studies. She defied entrenched ideas about both race and art. Was that the impetus for the book? I mean, why not a documentary?
The material lent itself more to a biography than a documentary because although there are hundreds of photographs available, there's very little film or video. And the life story needed to be told from a perspective that was not only professional, it was also quite personal, and it involved many, many people whose voices needed to be included. So the idea of a biography gave us a way to weave together all these various elements of the life that we were beginning to see as Peggy did her interviews.
The dance claimed me. Why?
Why did the dance claim her?
Yes.
She found her power. She found her voice. She had wanted to become a physician. That was her goal. And Hunter College in New York was one of very few black students in that era at Hunter, and it was her goal to become a physician. When she graduated, jobs were closed to her in the medical profession, and she was hired by a WPA project, a youth project, to dance. The dancing was so stunning, and this all builds up to an interview she had with John Martin, who was the dance critic for the New York Times, and when she told him that she had wanted to become a physician so that she could heal people, he said, "You're already doing that, and you do that through the dance." So I think that for her, it tapped an absolutely fundamental root which connected her to her spirit, to her energies, to her talents, and there was no looking back once she began the dance.
Peggy, you talk about her spirit. You talk about her feelings that she really engendered in people. There's a lot in the book that really shows a side of her that was quite remarkable. Describe her to me. Describe how her movement and how her expression really made a difference.
That's a wonderful, challenging question because she was unique. The first time I presented on her work at a conference, and I had a videotape of her reciting Negro Speaks of Rivers, and how she choreographed that poem, that Langston Hughes poem. There was a former student of hers in the audience. The minute Pearl started to speak, this woman started to weep. She had a power in her articulation, in the way she put words together, in the expressiveness of her face, her eyes, the use of her hands, the tilt of her body. So just in her language, her physical language, her verbal language, she had a way of putting words together which was unique. And I miss it to this day. And when I listen to some of the interviews with her and can recall her way of putting things together. So there was an intelligence at play, which was physical, which was intellectual, which was emotional. There was a brilliant unity of these qualities which together make the spirit. And Murray's kind of looking at me. Murray, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, I'd like to add that audiences recognized this immediately when she began to dance in Cafe Society in Harlem, a nightclub, and when she danced at Negro freedom rallies, the audiences were stunned at the power of her expression, especially at her famous leaps. So even though her body was not a typical dancer's body, she was able to communicate through movement in a way that was instantly recognized by audiences, critics, by the public in general, wherever she went.
You know, there's a discussion in your book about her racial protest and her use of dance to really get that racial protest out. I'd like to know more about that because I think the audience would love to hear what happens during that period where she really uses her body, her movement, her dance, her expression, everything to protest what was going on in this country. Anyway,
I think it's hard for Americans now to really understand, unless they've studied the period, how vicious the racism was in this country, the lynchings that were going on, the worse than second-class citizenship that black people endured north and south. And she was brave. She took an interracial group of people in the late 40s to tour the South. They felt safe on the college campuses and universities, HBCUs, but in the towns that they drove through and looking for hotels, sleeping in beds that were urine-soaked because they couldn't get rooms. It was a terrible blot on American history, and it's still, there's still a stain. This was intolerable to her and to many whites and blacks, and she was part of a tradition in New York, and where she grew up in New York City, where there was an active cooperation between whites and blacks to protest this lamentable state of affairs.
Tell me this, though, Peggy. We have a woman who is a dancer, and certainly she's not your typical dancer in the sense of being very lithe and thin and, the kind of person who would have this sort of sex appeal, and yet her dance was accepted and loved, and as you said, you cried when you watched her, and other people felt the same way. And yet she also had a political side to her that was important to her, and she also had a side to her which was very humanistic. I'd like to understand how Pearl really, truly had all those sides and was able to get that across to the American public?
Well, a central theme of the book and of her life was a commitment to authenticity. She never did anything simply to entertain or to provide stage performance. Right from the beginning, when she was a student, she would be talking to African students at Columbia about the kinds of dances that she was interested in. She wanted to find out just where they came from and what they meant within the cultures in which they were being danced. And so even before she went to Africa, her commitment was to a kind of authenticity of movement, and I think that her audiences recognized that. There was a power in her body, certainly. She didn't look like a dancer, but she communicated very powerfully, and she certainly didn't look like even other modern dancers, because she was a very dark woman, and she could not possibly have passed for any other kind of person in American society. Yet, the fact that she was using these qualities of her body and so authentically did get across to audiences right from the beginning. And then when she went to Africa, that aspect of her personality deepened because she learned the authentic dances of the villages, and she became committed to their authenticity for the rest of her life.
Peggy, her American life, let's talk about that before she goes to Africa to understand how she led her life and what made it unique.
Well, the life in New York that in the 40s, when she was bursting onto the New York dance scene, was very much involved with white Jewish intellectuals, radicals, and people. There were political rallies happening all the time. There were work for equal rights, civil rights, and an intense involvement with the black community.
People like Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger.
Harry Belafonte, Pete Seeger, Paul Robeson, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee. There was an elite group of very dedicated and political activists and artists.
Was she accepted among that group as well?
Oh, she was lionized by them. Yes, I mean she was really she was everywhere. And one academic up here put a Pearl Primus. She was all over it. He said to me, there was a rally, she was there. And when the labor rallies, the youth rallies, and many of some of them communist sponsored. And there was which became an issue later on in her career, that she'd been involved with organizations which had communist backing.
And what did that mean for her career?
What did it mean? It created difficulties in her career. One of the things that Murray tracked down was her FBI file, and not too much of it is blacked out. And it proves unequivocally that she never named names before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And there was some lingering concerns about that in the arts world.
On the other hand, the FBI was following her every move for quite a few years.
Was that a concern of hers? Did she?
Oh, yes. At one point, her passport was confiscated, and she didn't know if she'd be able to travel. And at that time, in the early 1950s, she was trying to travel back to Trinidad, where she was born, and she traveled throughout Europe and to Israel. So that was very important to her, and it also took a great emotional toll in the period, the McCarthy period.
It's a little strange to hear that she spent a lot of time in Israel, being a black woman in America, and a person who certainly had some difficulties here because of her racial situation. How does Israel fit into
her
this?
First husband was Jewish and was the son of a principal of a Torah school in Lower Manhattan, a very prestigious school. He had family in Israel. The first tours back to Israel were with him, and she was very well received and felt very at home in Israel. She had a German Jewish grandfather, so there was strong Jewish roots and connections in her life. A gift that she gave to very close friends is a mezuzah that had been in her family. So for her, there was never, these things were never contradictory. Her world was one of both and, not either or. And I think that sort of in a very simplistic way that speaks to her greatness. And she was for justice and for openness and for the arts availability. Says it in her statement, for all people everywhere, the dignity and power of all people everywhere, Not for my people, she says yes, but also for all people. And that's part of that connection. She was invited back to Israel several times, and she loved being there. She felt very taken care of and very well received.
You know, you say in the book that Pearl believed in the spirit world and in the power of the ancestors. And Murray, you mentioned that part of her connection to us was her trust to deal with the complexity and institutional politics of the actual world and her reliance on you, Peggy. What does that mean?
Oh, that's the biggest question. There were things that I never was able to get into the book because it just was sort of going off into too many directions. We were needing to stay focused. But I think many people writing biographies feel that they're being guided by their subject. And there was really a very powerful sense throughout the process of it, a very direct connection. And that actually took place as we write about in the book, in her death and dying. For me, there was a strong feeling of her presence in our home in the days right after her death, and there were all kinds of things happening in the house that were not explainable in easy ways. And then it was like her spirit cleared through it, and that was a very powerful experience. But there were other things going places, and people that we hadn't been able to reach in advance suddenly appearing in our path that were people who had been important to her that we needed to interview. Things on that order.
Let's jump from that to Langston Hughes, because I'm reading something from the book that says, hold fast to dreams, for when dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. Langston Hughes. Why did you use that in the book? And
beautiful reading of it. Yeah.
Well, Langston Hughes was an admirer and a great supporter of hers. And in 1943, when she appeared at the first Negro Freedom Rally in Madison Square Garden, he was present. And he wrote the most magnificent column for the Chicago Defender, the newspaper he would regularly write for. And we were able to include the whole column in our book. It's called On Leaping and Shouting. It shows how profoundly he was affected by her dances and how much her movement connected with his sense of the movement of words, because he does capture the movement of the dance in his column. The two of them were mutually influential. He gave her advice when she was going to the South, and she inspired a good deal of his writing.
And I'd like to just tell you one little story that's not in the book that a man told me who was very close to her, a white man, whom she felt actually had black ancestry, and told him that. He lost a child, a 3-year-old child. He and his wife were away for a weekend. The child wandered off following a dog to a river and was drowned. They went back to New York, and then they were going back to the site of this happening to have a memorial. And Pearl told them that the highway on their return trip would be completely lined with black crows, and told them why, that this was the death passage. They drove that trip from New York City to upstate New York, and the highway was completely lined with crows.